Imagine coming back to your own land one day, only to find 35 houses standing there, built without your permission, without even asking you once. And the people living there boldly tell you that this isn't your property anymore, that it now belongs to their community. That single moment shakes your very core. You feel anger boiling inside, betrayal cutting deep, and above all, a sense of humiliation. Because land is not just soil, it's honor, it's heritage, it's the bloodline of your family, and it carries your very identity. Now imagine you hold a secret that could change everything in an instant, a truth no one else knows. Those 35 homes, that entire community, are built just below a dam, and the control of that dam, the power to unleash it, lies in your hands. With just one turn of a valve, with one decision, you could alter their fate forever. The law doesn't seem to be on your side. The system refuses to listen, and justice could take years, if it ever comes at all. But in your heart, a voice whispers louder each second. This is my right, and I will take it back. At that point, only two paths lie before you. Stay silent and swallow the injustice, or take a step so bold that no one ever forgets it. As you grip the valve, you feel the roar of the water behind it, the unstoppable force waiting to be set free. And in that heartbeat, you know, whatever happens next will happen on your terms. In a single moment, destinies can be rewritten, dreams can be washed away, and truth can reclaim its place. The only question is, if you were standing where I stood, would you open the dam? It all began with a piece of land that meant everything to me. It wasn't just property, it was family heritage, a symbol of pride, and a reminder of where I came from. For generations, this land stood untouched, carrying stories of my ancestors and holding the promise of my future. But when I returned, what I saw left me speechless. My land had been taken over, and 35 houses now stood on it, built without my consent, without my knowledge, as if my existence didn't matter. The Homeowners Association, bold and unapologetic, declared that I had no claim anymore, that this was now their community. I tried to reason, I tried to fight, but every word felt like it was falling on deaf ears. The system didn't care, the law moved too slow, and with each passing day, my land slipped further out of my hands. But what they didn't know was that beneath their carefully built homes, beneath their comfort and security, lay a dam that I controlled, a dam that could decide their fate with just one twist of my hand. And in that silence, standing before it, I realized I had the power to take back what was mine. The story begins long before the dam, long before the houses, long before the anger that would later rise like a flood. It begins with the land itself. My land, to most people, it might have seemed like nothing more than a stretch of dirt and grass, an open field bordered by a line of trees and kissed by the slow bend of a river. But to me, it was history. It was memory. It was a living testament to everything my family had built, preserved, and handed down through generations. My grandfather used to say, "Land doesn't just belong to you, you belong to it. You're its caretaker, its voice, its protector." And I carried those words with me all my life. As a child, I would run barefoot across that soil, the earth warm under the summer sun, the smell of wildflowers carried on the breeze. My father would sit on the porch and tell me how each corner of that land carried a story. The old oak by the edge of the property was where he had carved his initials as a boy. The low ridge near the creek was where my grandmother once grew corn during a time when the family had nothing else to eat. The land was not just dirt. It was survival, legacy, and identity. Years passed, and I left for the city. I built a life, worked jobs, lived among strangers. But no matter where I went, that land pulled me back like a magnet. It was always there, in my mind, waiting, silent, eternal. I thought of it as untouchable. After all, it was mine. My family had the deeds, the papers, the history. Who would dare disturb it? Who would dare challenge something so sacred? The answer came to me on a day I will never forget. I had been away for months, caught up with work. When I decided to return and check on the property, I expected to see the same wide, open fields, the trees standing like sentinels, the silence broken only by the wind and the birds. But when I turned onto the old road that led to the land, my heart stopped. The horizon had changed. Where there had once been open space, I now saw rooftops, houses, dozens of them. I drove closer, my hands trembling on the steering wheel, my chest tightening with each passing second. By the time I reached the gate, I could hardly breathe. A sign stood tall and proud, "Welcome to Riverbend Community," managed by the Homeowners Association. Beyond the sign, a neatly paved road stretched forward, lined with identical homes painted in soft pastels. Children played in the yards. Cars were parked in driveways. People walked their dogs, waved to each other, laughed as if this had always been their neighborhood. As if my land had never existed before them. I stopped the car and stepped out. The air felt different, heavy, wrong. My boots crunched on asphalt where there had once been soil. My eyes darted from house to house, from stranger to stranger, searching for answers. How had this happened? How had 35 houses been built on land that was legally mine? I approached one of the residents, a middle-aged man mowing his lawn. "Excuse me," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can you tell me who authorized these houses?" "This is my property." He looked at me with confusion, then irritation, as if I were the intruder. "This isn't your property," he said flatly. "This is HOA land, part of Riverbend." And then he turned back to his lawnmower, dismissing me like a stranger passing by. I felt heat rise in my face. I moved further down the street, knocking on doors, speaking to people, trying to explain. Some shrugged, some laughed, some told me to leave before they called security. Finally, at the end of the cul-de-sac, I saw a small office with the letters OA Management printed above the door. I stormed inside, papers in hand, my family deed clutched like a weapon. Behind the desk sat a woman in a crisp blazer, her smile polished but cold. "I'm the owner of this land," I said, slamming the papers down in front of her. "You had no right to build here. Every inch of this is mine." She glanced at the documents, then at me, and leaned back in her chair. "Sir, this community was approved, developed, and is now under HOA governance. Whatever you think you own, you don't anymore. If you have an issue, take it up in court." Her words hit me harder than any punch. My land, my family's heritage, reduced to nothing more than a bureaucratic dismissal. I argued, shouted, demanded answers, but she remained calm, almost amused. "You don't understand," she said finally, her voice dripping with condescension. "This isn't your world anymore. This is ours." I walked out of that office shaking with rage. My hands were fists, my teeth clenched. I looked around at the houses, 35 of them, standing tall and smug on the soil that once carried my family's footprints. Children's laughter echoed in the air, but to me it sounded hollow, mocking. The lawns were green, the fences white, the streets perfectly clean. But all I could see was theft. All I could feel was betrayal. That night, I stood at the edge of the dam, looking down at the still water. I remembered how my grandfather once told me that the dam was both a gift and a weapon. It had been built to control the river, to protect the land from floods, but it also held the power to destroy. 35 houses now stood below, unaware of the secret above them. They thought they had stolen my land, that they had silenced me. But they didn't know what I knew. They didn't feel what I felt. And as the moonlight shimmered on the water's surface, a thought crept into my mind. A dangerous, intoxicating thought. Maybe justice wouldn't come from courts or papers or laws. Maybe justice would come from the river itself. Conflict doesn't always begin with a bang. Sometimes it begins quietly, like a whisper that grows louder with each passing day, until it becomes an unignorable roar. For me, the conflict began the moment I realized the people living on my land weren't just strangers. They were enemies who saw me not as the rightful owner, but as an intruder. That realization hit me harder than the sight of the houses themselves. The first confrontation was small but unforgettable. I stood in the middle of the street, surrounded by 35 houses that had no right to exist. My presence drew attention. Curtains shifted, eyes peeked out. Whispers traveled quickly from one neighbor to another. It didn't take long before a group of residents gathered. Their arms crossed, their expressions tight with suspicion. One of them, a tall man in a polo shirt with the HOA logo stitched across the chest, stepped forward. His tone was clipped, rehearsed like he had dealt with troublemakers before. "Can I help you?" he asked, though his words carried no kindness. "This is my land," I said firmly, holding up my papers like a shield. "These houses shouldn't be here. You had no right, any of you, to build on it." For a moment there was silence. Then laughter, low and sharp, cut through the air. A woman shook her head. Another man muttered something under his breath. Finally, the tall man replied, "I don't know what you think you're trying to prove, but this community is here to stay. The HOA owns it now. You don't." The words burned. "Owns it now," I repeated, incredulous. "You think a few fences and street signs can erase decades of ownership? My family worked this land before any of you even knew it existed." The tall man's eyes hardened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice but not his arrogance. "Listen carefully. This neighborhood isn't going anywhere. You're outnumbered, outvoted, and out of options. If you keep coming around, there will be consequences. Consequences." The word echoed in my mind. They had invaded my land, built their homes on my heritage, and now they dared to threaten me on top of it. My fists clenched, but I forced myself to turn away before anger got the better of me. I knew the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Over the following weeks, the conflict escalated. Every attempt I made to speak to the HOA was met with hostility. Letters went unanswered. Calls were ignored. When I returned to the community office, the receptionist refused to even look at my documents. "We've told you already," she said with an artificial smile. "This isn't your concern anymore." It wasn't just the HOA board either. The residents themselves began to see me as a threat. Whenever I drove past, eyes followed me. Children who once played freely in the streets were called indoors the moment I appeared. I heard whispers. "That's the crazy guy who thinks he owns the place. Why doesn't he just leave? He's dangerous." One evening, I stood near the old oak tree at the edge of the property, one of the few things still standing from before. A group of residents approached me, led by the same tall man. This time, he didn't bother with polite words. "You need to stop showing up here," he said, his voice sharp. "This is harassment. If you don't leave us alone, we'll get the police involved." I laughed bitterly. Police? On whose land? Mine. But even as I said it, I knew the truth. They had the numbers, the influence, the system backing them. The police wouldn't side with me. They would look at the houses, the families, the neat streets, and decide the HOA was legitimate. Meanwhile, my papers, my history, my blood ties to the land would be dismissed as nothing more than, or dispute. The humiliation was unbearable. Each word, each look, each dismissive gesture chipped away at me like a hammer striking stone. I wasn't just losing land anymore. I was losing dignity. Every visit ended the same way, me walking away, their smug faces watching, their laughter hanging in the air like smoke. But conflict has a strange way of planting seeds. With every insult, every threat, every attempt to push me out, they weren't just defeating me, they were shaping me. They were pushing me to a place I never thought I would go. One night, after yet another argument with the HOA board, I parked my truck by the dam. The moon cast silver ripples on the water, and the air was heavy with silence. I looked down at the rows of houses below, their lights twinkling like stars scattered across the ground. Families sat inside, watching television, eating dinner, laughing together, never once considering whose soil supported their lives. That was when the thought first became something more than a whisper. For weeks, I had felt the weight of injustice pressing down on me, suffocating me. But here, standing above it all, I realized I had power. Real, undeniable power. The dam was mine, the water was mine, and every house built on my land depended on my mercy. The conflict was no longer just about land or ownership. It was about survival. They had stolen from me, mocked me, humiliated me, and expected me to walk away. But I couldn't. Not anymore. Something inside me had shifted, something raw and unyielding. I was no longer the man who politely knocked on doors, who begged for recognition, who waved legal papers no one cared to read. I was something else now, something dangerous. As I stood by the valve, my hand hovering inches above it, I could still hear the tall man's words. "There will be consequences. He had meant them as a threat, but what he didn't know was that I held the real consequences in my hands. The conflict was no longer theirs to control. It was mine. Decisions are strange things. Sometimes they are made in an instant, without thought, like a reflex. Other times they grow inside you slowly, like a storm building on the horizon, until the sky is so heavy that it finally bursts. My decision came somewhere between those two extremes. It wasn't just anger, and it wasn't just impulse. It was the weight of years, of betrayal, of humiliation, all pressing down on me until there was only one path left. I remember the night clearly. The air was sharp, the kind of cold that bites your skin. The sky was heavy with clouds, hiding the stars. I had driven out to the dam again, unable to sleep, my mind restless. The truck's headlights cut through the darkness, and when I turned them off, silence swallowed everything. The only sound was the faint hum of water pressing against concrete, the dam holding back a force that begged to be free. I stepped out, my boots crunching against the gravel. In the distance, the faint glow of the HOA community lit up the valley below. From up here, the houses looked small, fragile, like toys placed carefully in rows. Families sat inside, warm and safe, unaware that above them, I stood with their fate resting in my hands. I walked slowly toward the control valve, the steel wheel glinting faintly in the moonlight. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, and a shiver ran down my spine. This was it, the line between thought and action. For weeks, I had toyed with the idea, telling myself it was just frustration, just fantasy. But tonight, it felt real, it felt possible. As I stood there, memories flooded me. I saw my grandfather working the soil with his bare hands, sweat dripping down his face, pride in his eyes. I heard my father's voice, teaching me that land was more than property. It was responsibility, identity. I felt the warmth of childhood summers, running barefoot through fields that no longer existed. All of it stolen, paved over, erased by strangers who laughed in my face and told me I was nothing. My other hand gripped the deed, the papers I had carried like a lifeline. I had shown them to everyone, neighbors, lawyers, officials, and each time they had been ignored, dismissed, or pushed aside. In my other hand was the valve, solid, unyielding, promising a different kind of justice. For the first time, I realized the law was not the only power in this world. Nature itself could decide, and I was the one who could unleash it. I closed my eyes, breathing deeply. In my mind, I saw two futures. In one, I walked away again. I went back to the city, back to a life of bitterness, watching from afar as my land became their playground forever. In that future, I was defeated, erased from history, my family's legacy reduced to dust under their houses. But in the other future, I turned the valve. Water thundered through tunnels, surging forward with unstoppable force. Streets drowned, houses crumbled. The neat little world they had built on my soil washed away. In that future, they would never forget me. They would know that this land had an owner, and that owner was not to be mocked, not to be dismissed. That future was terrifying, but it was also intoxicating. I opened my eyes, staring at the community below. A dog barked faintly in the distance. A car's headlights flickered for a moment before disappearing into a driveway. Ordinary life carried on, fragile and oblivious. I tightened my grip on the valve. My heart pounded so loudly I could feel it in my throat. "This is mine," I whispered, my voice shaking with rage and conviction. "This will always be mine." The decision crystallized in that moment. I no longer cared about courts or officials. I no longer cared about being reasonable. I no longer cared about what they thought of me. All I cared about was the truth, that they had stolen something sacred, and I had the means to take it back. I twisted the valve slightly, just enough to hear the hiss of pressure release. The sound was deafening in the silence, like the first warning growl of a beast that had been caged too long. My hands trembled, not from fear, but from the raw power I held. It was a power no lawyer could argue with, no homeowner could vote against, no system could silence. For a long time, I just stood there, listening to the rush of water deep within the dam, feeling its vibration under my feet. The decision was no longer a question. It was only a matter of time. When I finally let go of the valve, I stepped back, breathing heavily. My knuckles were white, my palms slick with sweat. I looked once more at the houses below, their lights glowing faintly in the night. They thought they were safe. They thought they were untouchable. But safety is an illusion. Stability is fragile, and all it takes is one man, one choice, to shatter it completely. That night, as I drove away from the dam, I knew I was not the same man who had arrived. The decision had been made. The flood was no longer just a possibility. It was a promise. The only thing left was to choose the moment. Action is the moment when thought becomes reality, when hesitation disappears and the line between choice and consequence vanishes forever. For weeks, the idea had lived in my mind like a ghost, haunting me, tempting me, daring me. But that night, under a sky torn open by thunder, the ghost finally took form. The storm had been building all afternoon. By dusk, the clouds were a bruised purple, rolling heavy over the horizon. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the valley where 35 houses stood in neat little rows, their lights glowing warmly, unaware of the shadow that loomed above them. I sat in my truck near the dam, rain pattering against the windshield, watching. My heart pounded like a drum. I knew this was the night. I stepped out into the storm. The wind hit me hard, carrying the smell of rain, soaked earth, and the metallic tang of electricity. My jacket clung to me as the rain intensified, soaking me to the bone. The roar of the river against the dam was louder than ever, as if it too had been waiting for this moment. The control valve stood before me, seek with rain, its steel body gleaming under flashes of lightning. My hand hovered above it, trembling not with fear, but with anticipation. For so long, I had been powerless, mocked by neighbors, ignored by officials, dismissed by the system. But here, in this storm, I held more power than all of them combined. With one turn, I could rewrite everything. I gripped the valve with both hands and began to turn. At first, it resisted, stubborn and heavy, but then it gave way with a groan, like the dam itself was waking from slumber. A hiss filled the air, followed by a deep rumble from within. The vibrations coursed up through my arms, into my chest, rattling my bones. And then, the water came. It started as a low roar, then built into a deafening thunder as the gates opened wider. A torrent of water burst forth, exploding into the spillway, white foam churning violently in the darkness. The ground trembled beneath my feet, and the air filled with a mist so thick it clung to my skin. From above, I watched as the flood surged down the valley, snaking its way toward the community below. Streets that had been dry only moments before were now rivers, swallowing curbs and sidewalks in seconds. Cars were lifted from driveways, tossed like toys. Streetlights flickered and died as water consumed their bases. The houses, those 35 stolen monuments to arrogance, stood no chance. The first wave slammed against the nearest row, shattering fences, ripping open garages. Windows burst, doors splintered, and within moments, water gushed inside, swallowing living rooms and kitchens whole. I could hear faint screams carried up by the storm. Families scrambling, dogs barking, children crying. People ran through the streets, but the water was faster, merciless. It didn't matter who they were or what they believed. The flood treated them all the same. My heart pounded. My breath came ragged, but I couldn't look away. There was a terrible beauty in it all, the raw force of nature unleashed, the fragility of human arrogance exposed in seconds. The neat lawns, the pastel-painted houses, the carefully planned streets, all of it undone in a single night. For a moment, I felt guilt tug at me, a voice whispering, "These are families, people with lives." But then another voice roared louder, drowning it out. "And what about your family? What about your land, your heritage, your dignity? Did they care when they laughed in your face? Did they care when they stole what was yours?" The second voice won. I tightened my grip on the valve, opening it further. The roar doubled, the dam shuddered, and the flood raged stronger. Entire rows of houses disappeared under the current, rooftops vanishing beneath the waves. Power lines sparked and snapped, plunging the valley into darkness. Only the flashes of lightning illuminated the chaos, capturing glimpses of the destruction like photographs etched into my memory. In that darkness, I stood tall, soaked in rain, my face lit by the storm. For the first time in years, I felt something I thought I had lost forever: control. This was not the system's victory, not the HOA's dominance. This was mine. Every drop of water carried my name. Every shattered wall was my revenge. Every scream was proof that I had been heard at last. Minutes stretched like hours. The storm and the flood became one, nature itself joining my cause. By the time I began to close the valve, the valley was unrecognizable. Streets were gone, replaced by rivers. Houses had collapsed, broken shells floating aimlessly. The proud HOA sign that once welcomed residents to their community was torn from the ground, bobbing helplessly in the current. I stood there, chest heaving, rain streaming down my face, watching the aftermath unfold. Silence returned gradually, broken only by the distant cries of survivors and the relentless rush of water. The deed in my pocket was soaked, but it didn't matter. I no longer needed papers to prove ownership. The land itself had spoken, and it had chosen me. I turned and walked back to my truck, each step heavy but certain. The storm began to ease, the thunder fading into the distance. Behind me, the valley lay in ruins, 5 houses erased as if they had never existed. My land was scarred, yes, but it was mine again. As I drove away, I caught one last glimpse in the rearview mirror, a dark, flooded valley glistening under the fading storm. Some might have called it destruction. To me, it was justice. And in that moment, I knew I hadn't just opened the dam. I had opened a new chapter, one written not by laws or associations, but by the unstoppable will of a man who refused to be forgotten. After the roar of the flood came silence, a silence so deep it felt unnatural, as though the world itself was holding its breath. The storm had passed, the thunder rolled away into the distance, and the rain slowed to a drizzle. What remained was not the tidy neighborhood that once stood proudly on my land, but a drowned valley, a graveyard of houses, dreams, and arrogance. I stood on the ridge the next morning, the first light of dawn breaking through the heavy clouds. Mist rose from the water that now covered most of the valley, giving everything an eerie, ghost-like quality. The streets were gone, replaced by rivers. Cars floated aimlessly, doors open, windows shattered. Pieces of furniture bobbed in the water. Chairs, children's toys, a mattress spinning slowly in the current. The houses themselves were broken shells. Some had collapsed entirely, roofs caved in and walls split apart. Others leaned awkwardly, half submerged, as though clinging desperately to survival. I breathed deeply, the damp air filling my lungs. It was not the land I remembered from my childhood. It was scarred, wounded, and unrecognizable. Yet, beneath the destruction, there was something pure. My land had spoken. It had shaken off the weight of strangers who claimed ownership, washed away the arrogance of those who laughed in my face. It was raw again, stripped back to its essence, as if reminding me that no matter how man tried to tame it, nature always had the final word. But victory is never clean. Down below, survivors picked through the ruins, wading through waist, high water, searching desperately for what little they could salvage. I saw a man carrying a child on his shoulders, her face streaked with mud and tears. A woman stood knee-deep in the flood, clutching a photograph framed to her chest, as though it were the only thing she had left in the world. Their cries echoed faintly through the valley, carried upward by the wind, haunting and heavy. For a moment, guilt pressed against me like a weight. These were people, families, innocents who may not have known the truth of how this land had been stolen. Perhaps some of them were just pawns, caught in the HOA's game, unaware of the legacy they had built upon. That voice inside me, the same one that had whispered doubts the night before, tried once more to break through. You've gone too far. Look at what you've done. But then I remembered every humiliation, every smirk from the HOA board, every time they told me to leave, every time they dismissed my family's history as if it were nothing. I remembered standing in the office, deed in hand, being told, "This isn't your world anymore. This is ours." And just like that, the guilt evaporated. Because I hadn't destroyed their world, they had destroyed mine first. I had simply reminded them that theft has consequences. From my vantage point, I saw the HOA sign half buried in mud, its once bright paint smeared and broken. The proud symbol of their authority lay toppled like a fallen monument. It struck me then power is temporary. Communities rise, Houses are built, systems declare themselves in control, but in the end, all of it can be undone in a single night. Reporters arrived by afternoon. Helicopters circled overhead, cameras capturing the devastation. Their voices carried snippets of words I could barely hear. Flooding, disaster, unprecedented. None of them spoke of me, not yet. To them, this was still a natural tragedy, a storm gone wrong, a dam weakened by weather. But I knew the truth. I was the storm. I was the reason the valley drowned. As the days passed, the floodwater receded slowly, leaving behind mud, debris, and silence. The residents who remained wandered through the wreckage like ghosts, faces hollow, eyes vacant. The HOA office was gone, swept away, its records and papers dissolved into the river. The tall man who once threatened me, the one who told me I was out of options, his house had been one of the first to collapse. I didn't know if he survived. Part of me hoped he hadn't. Yet, even in ruin, the land began to breathe again. The water carved new paths, reshaping the soil, cleansing it. The air smelled fresher, cleaner, as though the earth itself was relieved. And standing there, I realized this was not just destruction. It was rebirth. I walked the edges of the valley one evening, the sun setting behind me, casting long shadows across the wreckage. My boots sank into mud, each step heavy, deliberate. I reached down, scooped up a handful of earth, and let it fall through my fingers. It was mine again. Not in the way papers or laws declare ownership, but in the way truth declares it. The land knew me. The river knew me. And now, so did they. People will tell stories of this flood for years to come. They will call it tragedy, disaster, act of God. They will speak of how quickly safety can turn to chaos, how fragile a neighborhood can be when nature decides otherwise. But those who lived it, those who watched their houses crumble and their streets vanish, they will remember something more. They will remember the man who stood above the dam, the man whose land they tried to take, the man who proved in the most undeniable way that you cannot erase legacy with arrogance. And so, as the valley lay in ruins, I felt no fear of what was to come. Perhaps the law would come for me. Perhaps the world would brand me a criminal, a monster, a destroyer. But none of that mattered. What mattered was that my family's land was no longer theirs. What mattered was that my silence had ended. I turned away from the valley, the cries of survivors fading into the distance. The flood had spoken, and I had listened. Justice doesn't always come from courts or contracts. Sometimes it comes from water. And as the last light of day slipped below the horizon, I whispered to the land beneath my feet, "Why are whole again?"